I want you to say something with me. Say it out loud with me. I am not a broken person. And then I need you to complete the second half. I am a healing person. Now let's say it all together. I am not a broken person. I am a healing person. Understand the importance of the perspective shift of that statement. That it's so easy for us after 18 months like we've had, where each and every one of us have walked through battle after battle and trial after trial and loss after loss and hurt after hurt. If you're not careful, you will begin to confuse your battle with your identity. That you'll begin to confuse that you're just forever going to be hurt, forever going to be broken, because this is just who you are. And this series is about rejecting that. It's about a willingness to receive the brokenness that we experience and the hurt that we experience and the grief that we experience. But it is refusing to allow those things to become who we are. And instead grounding ourselves in the identity of who Jesus is and who he says we are. And what Jesus speaks over our lives is that in him and through him, we are not broken, but we are good. We are maybe going through broken things, but we are a healing person. Can I get an amen on that? And so today, as we begin this series on grief, naturally, as we talk about grief, I need to talk about beach balls. I know, obviously, right? You're like, clearly, this is what we're going to go to next. I was thinking this week as I was preparing for this teaching on grief, thinking about how do I bring to life what grief feels like, what grief can look like. And I was brought back to when I was a bit younger, and I was in Arizona, a.k.a. hell, and during the summer at least, very hot. And so I remember during summertime in Arizona, it's common in Arizona that you would have swimming pools, right? And in Arizona, I would often engage in a wrestling match, me versus a beach ball. And I would sit in the pool, and I would get on top of the water, and I would do everything I could to keep the beach ball underneath the water. And I would use all my strength, all of my willpower, I would do it. And I'm sure my dad was really, really excited about his 17-year-old son wrestling a beach ball in the pool. Just kidding, I wasn't 17, I was 10, all right? I'm a little concerned that you thought I was serious, but I'm in the swimming pool wrestling this beach ball, just trying to keep it down underneath the water, and maybe for a moment or two, I would have enough strength and enough willpower, but at some point, my center of gravity would be thrown off, and this beach ball that was underneath the water, what would happen? It would come shooting above the surface for everyone to see. See, I wonder how many of us, if we were to look at that metaphor and apply it to our lives, how many of us are wrestling beach balls? I wonder how many of us over the past, 18 months, we realized that beach ball, we're wrestling regret. And we're trying to shove that regret down deep underneath the water, down where no one could see it. Maybe for others, it's abuse. And so you're trying to just get it down deeper and deeper and more out of sight because you think, time heals all wounds. So if I just get it out of sight long enough, I'll get better. It'll all turn around. Maybe for others of you, it's loss. Maybe loss of a loved one. Maybe a loss of a family member. Maybe it's not loss as in the death of a loved one, but perhaps it's the death of a relationship. A relationship that you thought was going to last forever. A relationship that you thought you could make it through any storm, and then you went through the storm called the pandemic. And all of a sudden, you found that relationship fell completely apart, and you carry with you this deep sense of loss. And so you work and you hustle and you keep yourself busy because as soon as time slows down a little bit, all of a sudden that beach ball starts shooting to the surface. Maybe for others of you, it's hurt. Maybe for others of you, it's trauma. I bet we could go on and on about what might be represented in the beach ball or beach balls in your life. But this series is about us coming to terms with the things that lie underneath of our lives. I was thinking about surfing in light of this as well, and if you're a surfer, and I'm not a surfer, I'm more of a faller because I can barely ever surf, but I am on my board in the water. And one thing I realized on my board in the water attempting to surf is there's a lot going on underneath the water. And sometimes there's so much going on underneath the water that I could just be like here, and then all of a sudden, 20 minutes later, I'm way over here. I heard one person say there's a lot of water in the water. It's this idea like there's a lot of things going on underneath the water that you feel, and I think that's a great metaphor for life. There's a lot of water in the water sometimes. That you're like sitting on the surfboard called your life, and for the past 18 months, some of us started over here, ready to catch the next big wave, but 18 or so months later, you're way over here, and it's hard to even see the shore anymore. There's a lot of water in the water. This series is about addressing what might be underneath each and every one of us. And by the way, I don't tend to believe that necessarily 2020 created a lot of the new hurts and new wounds and all these new things, but it seems to me that what 2020 did, and when this pandemic hit in March of 2020, is it knocked all of our center of gravity off. It was like all of us, we were getting pretty good maybe at wrestling some of this hurt, but then the pandemic happened, and bam, we're knocked to the side, and now all of those beach balls that we had lying underwater came rushing to the surface. Can anyone relate to what I'm talking about? See, we need to talk about this because if you hurry past your hurt, you're never going to heal. If you never make eye contact with the hurt or loss or trauma or disappointment that you've experienced, you're never fully going to heal. Father Richard Rohr, he says this. He said this about grief. He said, grief, in its most simple definition, is unfinished hurt. Grief, in its most simple definition, is unfinished hurt. And so if grief is unfinished hurt, then it's a fair question to ask, what is unfinished hurt? And I would define unfinished hurt as hurt or loss or defeat or trauma or abuse or regret that we have not reconciled with. It is hurt, loss, defeat, or regret or bitterness that we have not yet absorbed and learned from in our life. Unfinished hurt is that tension that hums underneath the water of your life. It is the tension that causes your neck to get stiff. It's that water under the water that you feel as you're trying to live your everyday life. It is that hurt and loss and disappointment that needs to be resolved, because if it's not resolved, then you will carry with you this low-level humming called grief in your life. Because there's a difference between hurt that has been healed and hurt that has been hidden. A lot of people are like, I'm healed from my hurt. No, you've just gotten really good at hiding it. And so this series is not about how do we hide our hurt, but it is how do we actually heal from our hurt. It's about making eye contact with it and allowing, whether it's 1 or 100 beach balls, to come to the surface, to be seen, and to be reconciled with. Now, this won't be easy for some of us. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say it probably won't be easy for any of us. I found the longer, especially that you've been in the church world, the harder it is to do this sort of thing I'm talking about. And I think it's because the church historically seems, especially in the West, I'll say actually not historically, but in the West historically, has struggled with struggle. Like we struggle to talk about struggle. We just want to power through and work through and just like get to the other side of it. And so naturally, we just don't really talk about struggle very well. Or we have, if we do talk about struggle, these like religious bumper stickers that I'm sure many of you have experienced when you brought your whole self and maybe your dark moment to somebody, and somebody with good intentions. Maybe it was a job that the door closed and opportunity shut and you're disappointed, and you bring it to somebody, and somebody with the best of intentions in the church says something like, well, you know, when a door shuts, God opens a window. And you're like, I ain't climbing out of the building. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, you know, and it's this well-intentioned saying that's supposed to make you feel good, but it doesn't, does it? Or a loved one passes away, and people in the church, especially when it comes to death, especially death that makes zero sense, a death that is on the other side of prayers for life. The church at times can be guilty of saying things like, well, you know, God just needed another angel. See, sometimes it seems that the way Christians navigate struggle, it looks a lot like this meme that you're probably familiar with. This is, to me, probably the perfect picture of how sometimes it feels Christians look at the struggle and heartache and loss around us. We just sort of sit there, we're like, this is fine. It's all good. Let's just pretend this isn't happening. but we're a church that has difficult conversations and creates space for difficult things. We're not going to run away from it. See, I think for many of us, this is a series that's been a long time coming. So let me tell you what this series is not going to be. The series is not going to be me standing up here and pontificating on why that hurt happened or offering religious platitudes to you as to why that hurt happened. I'm not going to do that in this series, I promise. This is also not going to be a series where I either explicitly or implicitly sort of suggest that you get over it. Like you just need to sort of get over your grief. Have you noticed those who say they're over their grief are usually the ones who actually aren't? See, I've come to believe, and I haven't always believed this, but I've come to strongly believe that grief is not something you get over as much as it's something you absorb and integrate into your life. Even after Jesus was risen from the dead, his scars were still visible to his disciples. He absorbed death and even reflected some of it post-resurrection. You see, this isn't about us getting over the friendship that ended. It's not about us even getting over the abuse that you endured or the loss that crushed you. Just like a person whose leg is amputated. When that leg is amputated, they don't just kind of say, well, you don't just say, well, get over it. It'll grow back. That's not how it works. But on the other side of that amputation, your center of gravity changes and you find a new way to walk. Your life and the way that you conduct yourself changes from that point forward. See, you don't have control over what pain you experience, but you have control and agency over what stories your scars will tell. And so this series is about us going from wounds to scars and absorbing the hurt and loss and disappointment, integrating it into our life and allowing God to use it to tell a story that others need to hear. And so this series, we're going to be looking at this one story in John chapter 11. John chapter 11 is a troubling story, to say the least. It's a troubling story about a man named Lazarus who would eventually die. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be unpacking this story. The first week, we're going to be looking at the road. So we're going to today look at the road. Next week, we're going to be talking about the rock, not Dwayne Johnson, a different rock. And then the week after that, we're going to be talking about the resurrection, or rather, Corey Leak is going to be talking about the resurrection on Halloween Sunday. So this series is going to be, I believe, just a powerful series for us to begin to absorb, but maybe what many of us have avoided. So let me give you a quick overview of what's happening here in John 11. Jesus and his disciples get word that one of Jesus' closest friends named Lazarus has become sick, and not just kind of sick, not just a runny nose, not just a bad cough, but Lazarus actually is deathly ill. And you would think that Jesus, being a close friend of Lazarus and having a good track record of healing people who were sick, you would think that Jesus would rush to the aid of his good friend Lazarus and heal his friend. But that's not what happens. In fact, here's what we see happen in John 11, verse 5. Jesus gets word that Lazarus is deathly ill, and in John 11, verse 5, it says this: "So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days." He had heard the story that Lazarus was deathly ill, that he was on his deathbed and things weren't looking good. Jesus hears this news, and what we're told in verse 5 is that although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed, knowing what he knew now, where he was for the next 2 days. You see the problem with that, right? I mean, that would be like me saying, Jenna was in need of my immediate help, and so because I loved Jenna so much, I waited 4 days to respond. None of you would be going, hey, husband of the year. And yet, this is what we see Jesus do. This is one of those stories, if we're honest, it will really mess with your theology. And that's why I think when I've heard this story taught often, because it's a fairly popular story, because the end is really good, spoiler alert, that typically we skip this part and go straight to the end in churches when I've heard this sermon. But I have to believe that Luke kept this part in the story, this part that disrupts our theology for a reason. This part that makes us uncomfortable for a reason. The author, Luke here, seems completely comfortable with the mysterious tension that this story raises. That although Jesus loves people, terrible things still happen. And terrible thing does happen. Lazarus, the one that Jesus said he loved, we're told that after 4 days of Jesus not showing up, after 4 days of Lazarus being dead, then we're told that Jesus finally arrives where Lazarus is. Now, I hate being late to anything. Anybody with me? Like, you just hate being late? Some of you raise your hand, but you're always late to church, so I don't get that. But anyways, called out. All right, so I hate being late to anything. Now, I can only imagine, like, the idea of being 4 days late to a funeral makes me want to, like, break out in hives. And yet, Jesus is not only late, he's 4 days late, which is a really interesting thing to consider, because to the Hebrew people who Jesus was interacting with and who Jesus was, the Hebrew people believed that when a person died, their spirit would sort of hover over their dead body for 3 days, but then on the 4th day, their spirit would depart. So we're told that Lazarus was dead how many days? 4 days. So to the Hebrew people, including Jesus, this would tell them one thing. Lazarus was not only dead, he was dead. He was dead as dead could be. And that is when Jesus shows up, at the point when everyone else would have concluded, well, Lazarus is beyond hope. And that's when Jesus shows up. And that's where our story picks up in verse 17. It says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. In other words, they're saying, it's too late. It's like real too late, Jesus. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. And when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Now, if you've been in the church world for a while and have heard sermons for a while, you've probably heard of Martha. And unfortunately, probably the story you've heard the most about Martha was the time that Martha was throwing a party for Jesus and was obsessing over all the details of the meal and what needed to happen and what was going on. And so typically when sermons about Martha come up, it's typically a message about don't be like Martha, be like Mary. Don't be like obsessive Martha who sweated the details but missed the main point. And sure, there's a sermon there that we should talk about, but she usually gets a pretty bad rap. She's usually the punchline in the story of most sermons. Don't be like Martha. And don't get me wrong, Martha, like all of us, had some things that she clearly needed to work through. But you got to give Martha some credit here in this story. Because Jesus was 4 days late. They asked Jesus to show up. They thought Jesus would show up. They expected Jesus to show up. And he did not show up. And so while everyone else is staying at home, consoling one another, Martha gets wind that Jesus is approaching, and so she meets Jesus on the road. So we can give Martha some flack maybe over some things, but we got to give her some credit here, because while everyone else stayed home, at least Martha met Jesus on the road. And what I love about Martha is when she approaches Jesus, have you ever seen a person walk towards you and you're like, this is not going to be good? I'm pretty sure that's how Martha was walking that day. That she was walking to Jesus, and she doesn't hold back. Verse 21, this is what Martha said to Jesus. In verse 21, she says, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Wonder how many of us have prayed that prayer this past year. God, if you only would have showed up. If you only would have answered my prayer. If you only would have met me here. Man, it's a human prayer. She says, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. He said, and then she says, yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. And Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? Yes, Lord, she told him. I've always believed you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. Then she returned to Mary, and she called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. So Martha meets Jesus here on the road, and she gives Jesus a piece of her mind. She's not holding out. She's not holding back. But something else becomes abundantly clear from Martha's interaction with Jesus, something that if you're not paying attention, you might miss. And that is that these verses that we just read tell us one thing about Martha. Martha is a mess right now. Martha is a mess right now. This is one of those scriptures where you can visualize Martha is speaking through gritted teeth. She is holding back her tears, but it is clear that she is all over the place. And you can tell by just looking at her words. She first tells Jesus, if only you had been here, then Lazarus would not have died. But then she says, well, even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. So she's like over here, and then she jumps over here. And then Jesus is like, well, that's good news that you believe that because, I'm going to raise him from the dead. And then Martha, after saying she believed that God could give Jesus whatever he asked, she flips again. Is like, she thinks Jesus is giving her some like religious bumper sticker. Yeah, I know, you're going to raise everyone alive back when the world ends. I know, Jesus. I've heard it all in Sunday school before. Like just after she said that God could give him whatever that he asked for. And then Jesus says to Mary, no, I really am the Messiah. I am the one you've been waiting for. I'm going to do this miracle today. Do you believe that? And Martha, she says, yes, I've always believed that you're the Messiah, the Son of God, which sounds beautiful. But then what does she do next? If it were me, and I believed I'm talking to someone who's going to raise someone else from the dead, I'm taking him to the tomb right away. But she doesn't do that. Even after saying, I believe you're the one we've been waiting for, the Messiah, what does she do? She goes to Mary's house, and what does she tell Mary? She says, the teacher's here, and he wants to talk to you. So in one breath, she's saying, you're the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. She doesn't go to the tomb, though. She goes to Mary and refers to him only as teacher. So like, what is it, Martha? See, what I want you to see from this is a very human story, a very human interaction, and what we get here is that Martha is zigging and zagging all over the place. That in one breath, she's like, yes, God can give you whatever you ask. And in the next breath, she's like, I know, it's probably not going to happen now. In one breath, she's saying that you're the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. And then in the next breath, she's like, here's the teacher, Mary. Come on, all of you, I would bet on some level over the past 18 months, you've been zigging and zagging your way through the past 18 months. That on Sunday, you're like, God, you conquered death, and you can bring me victory in my life. And then in Monday, you're going, God, where the heck are you? And then on Sunday, you're going, God, I believe that you're going to bring resurrection in this circumstance. I believe you're going to bring life to this area of death. And then all by Monday, you're already going, God, I don't even know if I believe anymore. And here's what I want you to see. It's so important. That even through all the zigging and zagging that Martha takes Jesus on, that when Jesus meets her in that moment, Jesus never once seemed to be offended by her doubt. That not once did Jesus scold her for her grief, but instead he was a safe space for it. And I think what Jesus doesn't say is as important as what Jesus does say. See, what he doesn't say in this moment is like, do you know who you're talking to? What he doesn't say in this moment is like, hey, maybe if you had just a little more faith, maybe if you just prayed a little bit more, I closed the door, but did you see the window, Martha? Like, did you see it? He doesn't say any of that. But he creates a safe space for Martha to zig and zag through her hurt, her doubts, her faith, her anger, and her disappointment in Jesus. See, if you're new to faith, or perhaps you were even raised in more of a fundamentalist background of Christianity, I want to say something that I think is so true and important for you to understand, and that is that our doubts and anger may offend Christians, but it does not offend Christ. It doesn't offend Christ. But instead, he creates a safe space for that. See, I've noticed something throughout the ministry of Jesus, and that is that those who were closest to Jesus were the ones who were most vulnerable with Jesus. David was nicknamed a man after God's own heart. Who wouldn't want that nickname? That's epic. But do you know 70% of the Psalms that David wrote in the Bible were laments? He constantly was lamenting that God didn't seem like God was showing up or holding his end of the bargain. And he was constantly dealing with this tension of like, God, I love you, but there's times where it doesn't feel it's being reciprocated. God, I believe in you, but there's times that it feels like you're absent. And yet this man is known as a man after God's own heart. Peter, he was an emotional roller coaster. I mean, one second he is telling Jesus that he's the Messiah, and then the next second he's trying to boss Jesus around so much so that Jesus is like, you're being Satan right now. Not a good day. And yet Peter would go on to be the rock that the entire church would be built on. He was this man who lived with his emotions on his shoulders. He was very in tune and present with what he was feeling, sometimes annoyingly so, if you watch Peter. And then you have Martha. You have Martha who, whether you like it or not, she tells Jesus what she's thinking. She expresses to Jesus what she's feeling. See, this tells us something about Jesus, because Jesus was close to those who practiced vulnerability with him, but he seemed to not be as close to those who offered Jesus religious rhetoric. And what this tells me about Jesus is that Jesus doesn't meet you where you pretend to be. He can only meet you where you really are. And I wonder if some of you, you're like, why am I not experiencing Jesus in my life? And I wonder if you're honest, it's because you're trying to get Jesus to meet you where you pretend to be. And Jesus is like, I can't meet you where you pretend to be. I can only meet you where you actually are. You see, when we open up our whole selves, the good, the bad, and the ugly, Jesus never seems to flinch. He just creates space for it. Verse 32 says, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Now, it would be inconsistent if Jesus was mad that they were expressing remorse or sadness over the situation. I don't think Jesus was angered at where they were at emotionally. Rather, and this could be conjecture, but I think it's more consistent. I think Jesus was angry because death was never a part of the plan. I think Jesus was angry because even though he might see the bigger picture, a good father takes on the hurt of his children regardless. Like, I feel my daughter Finley's hurt. Like, I see she's sick this week. She's been super sick. It's super sad. She's probably watching online at home right now. Finley, I love you. Take your medicine. But, like, I see that she's going to make it through. She's going to be fine. But she just walks around yesterday. She's like, I just want to go to bed. And, like, she's just miserable. And it makes me miserable seeing her hurt and struggle. So I don't believe Jesus is angered because they're sad or disappointed or even angry with the outcome. And here's what Jesus does in verse 34. Jesus asks a peculiar question. He says, where have you put him? Where have you put him? They asked him. And they told him, Lord, come and see. And the question of Jesus, where did you put him, I think is powerful, but it's also peculiar because, like, if you're Jesus and you're God, you already know where Lazarus is. You know where everybody is. So why in the world does Jesus ask, where have you put him? See, I think it's a picture of how healing works. Jesus asks Martha and Mary and those there to show him where he is. And it reminds me that while Jesus knows our deepest hurts, we must still invite and give him access to those areas of deep hurt and loss in our lives. While Jesus would bring the resurrection, our role in this process of grief is to bring Jesus to our very source of pain. To say, here it is, Jesus. Here's the hurt. Here's the disappointment. Here's the loss. Here's the death. Here's the abuse. Here's the struggle. Here's the wound. Here is this tomb that I've been carrying. Here's this beach ball I've been trying to shove underneath the water for so long. Here it is. You see, many of us, we might meet Jesus on the road like Martha, but we'll stop short of bringing Jesus to the tomb. So we'll show up on Sunday, but we'll still keep Jesus only about an inch deep into our lives because we don't want to open ourselves up to risk. And opening your heart and revealing your hurt can be a risk. Even it was a risk for Martha and Mary. I mean, they had prayed and believed that Jesus was going to heal Lazarus, and he didn't the first time. So they were taking a risk by entertaining this question of taking Jesus to the tomb. But here's something we need to understand. Opening up your heart and revealing your hurt is a risk. But it is also a risk to not open up your heart and to not see how your deepest hurts can be transformed. There is no risk-free road forward with dealing with your hurt. Risk is baked into the whole thing, and the sooner you can make peace with that reality, the sooner you can begin to see where life takes you, and you can begin to make peace. But you should note this about peace. Making peace doesn't always feel or look peaceful. Sometimes making peace is one of the hardest things you will ever do. And here's what Jesus does. He goes to the tomb where Lazarus' body lay. And then there's this strange verse in John 11, verse 35. If you've been in church for a while, you probably remember it because it's the only verse you could ever commit to memory. John 11, verse 35 says this, then Jesus wept. Can we say that out loud? Then Jesus wept. It's important to understand that every gospel author had one purpose when telling the story of Jesus, and that is they wanted the reader to know that Jesus was in fact God and Jesus was in fact the Messiah. So it's interesting to me that Luke would include a story about Jesus crying. That's not really a great picture of strength, right? Like, can you imagine if there was a presidential candidate and all their PR images, all their images in their promo was them just crying? Are you voting for that president? I don't know. But Luke, the author, wanted us to know something about Jesus. And what he wanted us to know about Jesus is that Jesus weeps. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, yet he didn't show up and scold the crowd and ask, why don't you believe? Why don't you have more faith? He didn't show up and say, hey, want to see a cool party trick? Open up the tomb. He doesn't do any of that. Before he moves forward, Jesus begins to weep. He enters into their mourning with everybody else, and this should tell all of us something in this process of grief. And it should tell us that God is just as present in our mourning as he is in our miracles. That God is mysteriously here with us in our mourning just as he is with us in our miracles. David figured this whole thing out. Maybe that's why he was so open with his mourning. And he wrote about it in Psalm 56. David writes, he says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You've collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. David was very aware that God was with him somehow in his weeping. St. Ephraim, the Syrian who lived between 303 and 373, he was a doctor of the church, and in one of his writings, he wrote this. He considered tears to be a sacramental sign of divine mercy, and here's what St. Ephraim wrote. He said, give God weeping and increase the tears in your eyes. Through your tears and God's goodness, the soul which has been dead will be restored. See, I've come to believe that the weeping mode is a really different way of being in the world. Western culture doesn't like the weeping mode. We love the working mode. And we try and make the working mode work over the weeping mode. So we try and we work and we hustle our way past our hurt. We choose motion over emotion. But the weeping mode is different than trying to live your life fixing and explaining and attempting to force resolution that you often find in the working mode. See, when we give ourselves permission and space to be in the weeping mode, we are finally free to feel the tragedy of things, the sadness of things, the loss of things. I heard one person put it this way, that tears cleanse the lens of the eyes so we can begin to see more clearly. And they went on to say that sometimes we have to cry for a very long time because our eyes are so dirty that we're not seeing truthfully or well at all. The tears only come when we realize we can't fix it and we can't change it. Tears are a sign of you've come to the end of yourself. And it's in this space at the end of yourself that John 11 reminds us that Jesus is mysteriously present with us in that space. Which brings us back to why the Christian story is so revolutionary. Why is the Christian story so revolutionary? Our central Christian image, the central image of Christianity, is that of a naked, bleeding, and suffering man named Jesus. Have you ever wondered why God would go that route? Have you ever thought to yourself, well, if sin is such a big deal and God could do anything, then why would God choose the cross? Why would God choose suffering? Why would God choose this picture of Jesus bleeding and coming underneath the weight of the cross? It seems like an odd image to choose. I don't know about you, I could think of 1,000 different ways. And yet God chooses to solve the human dilemma through Jesus suffering on the cross. And for a while, I used to think it was just a bad idea. And it didn't make any sense. But now I've come to realize it makes perfect sense. What hope would there be if God only met us in the resurrections and never in the crucifixions? Why do we get an image of a bleeding, suffering, naked man under the weight of the cross as a symbol of hope? I think it's because Jesus and therefore God knew that life would be full of suffering, knew that life would be full of moments of struggle, and life would be full of moments of loss. And this good and loving God chose not to avoid our suffering, but instead, this God chose to meet us in suffering in order to lead us forward. The gospel is not just a picture of how God works, but also how grief works. That Jesus didn't avoid the pain. He faced it. He felt the weight of it. He felt the sting of it, and even allowed himself to be crushed by it. Jesus absorbed death, and God mysteriously moved, and from that space of death, God brought life and resurrection. Perhaps the cross and resurrection was never meant to be a picture of how God worked through Jesus, but it is a picture also of how God works through all people as we walk through this muddy and murky thing called life. Maybe it's an image of how God leads all of us to a resurrected life. And what that means is, yes, God can bring us to the empty tomb and to the point of resurrection, but He is just as much with us when we feel the sting and weight of loss and death and hurt. Before Jesus would raise Lazarus again, Martha had to meet Jesus on the road. She had to give herself permission to be a mess. And when she did, Jesus met her exactly where she was. I wonder how many of us, you stayed home in your hurt, you stayed home in your grief, you stayed home in the abuse, you stayed home in the trauma, you stayed at home in these things, these hurts. And today is your day to meet Jesus on the road. To meet Jesus on the road and not be something you're not, but allow Jesus to meet you exactly where you really are. And so may we meet Jesus on the road of our hurt and loss and disappointment. And may we allow Jesus to meet us where we are, not where we're pretending to be. And as we do this, may we discover that God is with you in your weeping. And God is with you in your mourning. And God has always been with you in your hurt. And may you be reminded that resurrection is coming.